So, welcome to the brain. Let's start out by getting ourselves oriented here and agreeing on some language. Uh, we're looking at a side view of the brain. We can turn it around and look at the front view, and here we're looking at a half brain. So let's figure out where we are and what the terminology is. This is the front of the brain. We call this the rostral end, or we call this the anterior end. So rostral and anterior both mean front. Up here is the dorsal surface of the brain, and you can think of the dorsal fin of a dolphin. So that's the dorsal surface. It's also known as the superior surface. Okay, so that's up top, dorsal superior. Down here is the ventral, the ventral surface here. Okay, okay, there you go. So that's the ventral surface there. And that would also then be known as the inferior. So you have dorsal superior, ventral inferior. We move to the back of the brain, and we have the caudal portion, caudal meaning tail, and it's also known as the posterior portion. Now, if we move the brain around and look at it from the front again, the lateral aspects of the brain are to the side here. So this would be lateral. Medial would be towards the center. Now let's look at the kind of gross structures of the brain here. So you see all of these grooves here and these peaks. These are known, the grooves are called sulci or sulci. I'll call them sulci just because that's what I'm used to. I think the sulci is becoming the favored use these days. And a singular would be a sulcus. Here you have a gyrus, which would be one. Gyri would be two. So you have sulci and gyri, or a sulcus here and a gyrus here. Now, if you recall from our talk about mitochondria and the inner membrane of the mitochondria where you see all the folding, and the purpose of the folding is to increase the surface area for ATP production, to increase ATP production. The same principle applies here. So all of this folding, all these gyri and sulci, what they do is they serve to increase the surface area of the brain. So you can think of it as a piece of paper that has been crumpled up. So you have a large piece of paper and you just crumple up in a ball. It gives you more surface area in a smaller space. And so it's my understanding that really about 2/3 of the cerebral cortex here can be found in the sulci here. So that's a fair amount. Another advantage to having this all crumpled up and close together is that the cell bodies, which lay here in the gray matter, have less far to travel. The axons have less far to travel to get to other places in the brain where they're going. So they travel on these white matter tracks on the inside of the brain. And there's, again, less distance to follow than if it were flat. Additionally, it brings areas of the brain closer together that you wouldn't normally find close together. So the cerebrum that you see here in blue, you can see it all the way around, it contains the cerebral cortex as well as some underlying structures, which would include, so this is the telencephalon that we talked about before. So that would include the hippocampus, the basal ganglia, and the olfactory bulb. Now the cerebrum has four major divisions or lobes, and your book says that the limbic system or the limbic lobe could be considered a fifth. So we'll certainly talk about that at great length at another time. But let's look at where those four lobes are. So in the front you have the frontal lobe here, which also includes, and I'm not sure why they keep those separate, but includes this area there. Okay, let's move this back up. All right. So this is the frontal lobe there. Here you have the temporal lobe. You move it around, and towards the posterior or caudal end, you have the occipital lobe, your right and your left occipital lobe. And then on the top, you have the parietal lobe. And this sensory strip here is also part of the parietal lobe. Okay, so let's take a look at where that was. So here you go. So it's on the side, and you go to the dorsal surface, and there it is. You look at it from the back, and it's superior. Okay, and again, frontal lobe, and this is part of the frontal lobe, and you look at it very frontal. The temporal lobe, you look at it from the back, and you see that it's what? You see that it's very lateral. So when you look at the middle of the brain here, and that's where we are. So let me turn this around so I can orient you. Okay, so here we're looking dead on the front of the brain. So we're looking at the sagittal section here. So this is a sagittal section, but this is mid-sagittal. This is right down the middle of the brain. This blue area in here is the corpus callosum. So it's a commissure, what's known as a commissure. So a commissure typically is something that joins things together, or where things are joined. And in the brain in particular, commissure is considered that white matter tracts are commissures. And so this is the largest commissure in the central nervous system, the corpus callosum, and its fibers join the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere. So let's talk about the ventricles. Let's find them first. So let's get rid of some of this stuff. We'll hide this. Okay, so deep inside the brain, we have the ventricles, and we talked about those before, especially when we were talking about the migration of cells out of the ventricular zone, the migration of neural progenitors or new neurons in early development. So here they are here. Here are the lateral ventricles, and again, they're lateral because they're lateral, they're away from the midline. Okay, so let's get rid of that again. Okay, we'll hide it. So what about these ventricles? So these ventricles, let's move around so you can see it, contains cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid is a fluid that flows through the brain. It cushions the brain. It flows on the inside through these ventricles, and on the outside on top of the brain. So the cerebrospinal fluid has proteins, glucose, has sodium and potassium and chlorides, full of ions. It's synthesized. Let's get this upright. So we're looking right on the side of the ventricle here. So it's synthesized in a structure called the choroid plexus, which are blood vessels inside the ventricles here that synthesize and make this cerebrospinal fluid. So it goes through these lateral ventricles where it's made and into the third ventricle here. So it goes down here into the third ventricle, down the cerebral aqueduct, and into the fourth ventricle down here, and then goes back up around the brain into the arachnoid matter, which is one of the three meninges of the brain that we'll talk about in just a minute. So the meninges, as you see here, see this is a picture here. You have your brain, and we're taking a small portion of the brain here. So the meninges are 3 layers of membranes that protect the brain and the spinal cord. The delicate inner layer is the pia mater, right here. Then you have the arachnoid, which is a spider web-like structure filled with fluid. So that's where the cerebral spinal fluid comes back up around and is taken back up by the arachnoid. And then the dura mater here is a tough outer layer, a rather hard outer layer that lays between the brain and the skull. And the skull then is here. And then you have, of course, your skin and your hair. And so this program has shown the meninges here, kind of to give you an idea that they are outer membranes that ensheath the whole central nervous system. It's not really, I don't think, a very good depiction of them, but it gives you an idea that they do cover the entire central nervous system. So let's take a look at some of the functional areas of the brain. If you remember, here we have the four lobes. We have the frontal lobe here, the temporal lobe here, the parietal lobe here, and the occipital lobe here. So let's start with the frontal lobe. We have the primary motor area, which is this gyrus right here, which is a precentral gyrus. So here you have the central sulcus, very important landmark feature. So the precentral gyrus, or the primary motor area, starts at the bottom of this sulcus and to the anterior side, so coming up this side, and includes this primary motor area, the precentral gyrus here. And so this is where the planning and execution of movement takes place, a very important area. You move out here and you have the prefrontal area, which is really, so this whole prefrontal area in here is has pretty much executive function. So this is all involved in planning, in organizing, in control over your emotions, in understanding social cues. All of this control over the limbic system takes place in the prefrontal cortex, in particular the medial prefrontal cortex, which hopefully we'll talk about when we move into the area of behavior. And here you have Broca's area here, which is involved in speech, and we'll get to that when we talk about speech. Down here in the temporal lobe, you have the primary auditory area here, which is in the superior aspect of the central sulcus, of the Sylvian fissure here. So this is a Sylvian fissure. This is your primary auditory cortex here, and it dips down into the Sylvian fissure. Here you have Wernicke's area, which is another language area that we'll talk about when we talk about language. Back here you have the visual cortex, so your occipital lobe is your visual cortex. And right here you have the primary visual area. This is where the optic nerve then goes through to the thalamus and then projects back into the primary visual area here. Up here you have your parietal lobe. Right behind the central sulcus you have the post-central sulcus, which is your primary somatosensory area. So this whole area, the somatosensory association area, in particular the primary somatosensory area, receives information from the periphery with respect to touch, with respect to pain and temperature, with respect to proprioception. That's where you are in time and space, so you know where your body is relative to where everything else is. And I wanted to stop and take a second here to talk about the homunculi. So in the primary motor area and in the primary somatosensory area, so that's the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus, they've actually mapped out where in the cortex, what in the cortex corresponds to what parts of the body. For example, if you stimulate this area here, you may get movement. So this is a motor area. You may get movement in the hand. If you stimulate this area here, you may get movement in the face, around the eyes. And you can see then how important certain areas of our body are relative to how much space they take up in the cortex. So this is a motor cortex here with your tongue and your pharynx. Over here you have the sensory cortex. Again, this is the postcentral gyrus, the primary somatosensory area, and you have, again, the hand, touch, over here, movement, very important, tactile, being fine motor skills. Here is to be able to touch with your fingers and with your hand. You have your face, your tongue down here. So these are actual physical representations of the areas that those parts of the brain represent. And I think I'll stop here for the night. Let me see if I've miss anything. Your book covers a lot of this. I don't want to cover more than your book covers because it's a lot of information, but be sure to know what's in the book. What I'm just trying to do is give you maybe a little bit better sense of where these structures are. I think sometimes a 3D model is a lot better than just a flat picture. So I'll move into some of the deeper brain structures in the next video.